Welcome to your deep dive. This time we're diving deep, really deep, into the case of Dennis Nilsen. You probably know him as the kindly killer, right? A civil servant, living an ordinary life on the surface, but underneath, responsible for these horrific murders. And that's what we're going to unpack today. The man, the crimes, those rituals, and the haunting fact that some victims, we still don't even know who they are.
It really gets to you the way Nilsen was able to just exist like a normal person with this whole hidden world of darkness inside.
Let's unpack it then. You sent over a ton of material about Nilsen, about his early life in Scotland. Was it there in his childhood that things started to go wrong? I mean, can we draw a line from there to the man he became?
Absolutely. Isolation, a strange comfort with death, that all seems to have been there from his early years. Losing his grandfather when he was a boy, that was really a turning point for him, it seems.
He actually saw the body, right? It's in the source material. Not unusual in itself, but for a kid that young.
Right, and Nilsen himself said that image, it never left him. And then there's that near-drowning experience. He said he felt this strange peace, like he was, I don't know, reunited with his grandfather almost. Like the line between being alive and being dead, it was blurred, even back then.
So death almost is comfort instead of something to fear.
It's a theme that comes up again and again in his life. It gets all tangled up with his sexuality, his struggle to have relationships that lasted, that meant something.
Which brings us to the 1970s, London. Nilsen trying to build some kind of life for himself, trying to connect. But the darkness is still there, isn't it? He even joins the police for a while. I mean, what do we make of that?
It's really unsettling when you think about it. On the one hand, there's this desire for order, right? To be part of the system, upholding the law. But then underneath it all, there's this compulsion he had, this need for control, for crossing the line.
So is it possible that for Nilsen, the law and breaking it, they weren't so different? Like two sides of the same coin, maybe.
It's a chilling thought, but yeah, it could be. And it gets to the heart of who Nilsen was. This wasn't some creepy loner hiding away. He had a job, a civil servant, he was active in his union, he had acquaintances who thought he was all right, maybe a little quiet.
The classic, he kept to himself kind of guy. Easy to overlook, easy to underestimate.
Exactly. And that's what makes Nilsen so disturbing. He makes us face the fact that darkness, it can hide anywhere behind the most ordinary faces. We think we know our neighbors, the people we work with. But what do we really know, right? What goes on in another person's mind?
The stark contrast, this double life, it's like something out of a movie, a psychological thriller or something.
And as we get into the actual crimes, that contrast, it just gets more and more disturbing.
And let's do that then.
Yeah.
His first murder, it was in 1978, is that right?
Yes, 1978, at his flat on Melrose Avenue. Nilsen would lure these young guys, vulnerable guys, back to his apartment, promises of food, a place to crash, some company, maybe a drink. He targeted people who were living on the edge, the kind of people who wouldn't necessarily be reported missing right away, you know?
Homeless, runaways, maybe struggling with their sexuality.
Exactly. It's a really tragic pattern, and it shows a certain amount of premeditation in his crimes, I think.
And after the murders, those rituals, Nilsen would wash the bodies, dress them up, even pose them. It's like he was creating these gruesome scenes.
It's like for him, death wasn't the end, but a beginning. Like it was the ultimate way to control and possess somebody, keeping those bodies under his floorboards, even talking to them. It's like he was trying to create this twisted kind of companionship.
That level of delusion is really hard to grasp, but it seems key to understanding him. It wasn't just about killing, but about what came after, this bizarre need to deny that death was final.
And it speaks to this deep loneliness in him, this inability to create real connections, real relationships. They're messy, they're unpredictable. But in death, he found a way to have this perverse kind of control.
This need to be in control, to dominate, it runs through his whole life, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And when we dig deeper into his later crimes, how his methods evolved, we see this need for control manifesting in even more disturbing ways.
And we're going to do just that right after this quick break. Don't go away. We'll be right back with more on this unsettling case, the case of Dennis Nilsen.
We were talking about control, right, and how it was this constant thing with Nilsen, but the way he got rid of the bodies, it's almost like that part, he didn't think about it the same way, not with the rituals and all that.
Compartmentalizing, almost like those meticulous poses versus just, getting rid of the bodies in the old way.
Exactly. He even moved flats in '81, went from Melrose Avenue to Cranley Gardens in Muswell Hill. But the murders, they didn't stop, and the way he disposed of the bodies, it just got more desperate, I guess.
And that's where the plumbing comes in.
Yeah. He'd used bonfires before, but at Muswell Hill, he started trying to put human remains down the plumbing. Can you imagine? It was a blocked drain that actually got him caught in the end. Some poor plumber.
It's almost funny in a dark sort of way.
Yeah.
Like you're saying, the rituals all thought out, but then the disposal, just careless. Almost like it was an afterthought, not part of the fantasy.
And that disconnect, that's part of what makes this case so fascinating, so disturbing. What does normal even mean, you know? This guy, he was someone's neighbor, helping with chores, chatting with the landlord. But all along, he had this horrific secret going on.
It's unbelievable. And speaking of unbelievable, Nilsen's confessions to the police, they weren't just, okay, I did it. It was like he enjoyed going into detail about the crimes.
It's true. He would give these really detailed accounts of the murders, the rituals, what he was thinking. It's like he wanted to explain himself, you know, to make people understand. He even said once, I worship the art and act of death.
Which is chilling. But what does that even mean in terms of psychology? Was it some way of dealing with trauma? Maybe he had delusions of grandeur or something else altogether.
It's a question that still fascinates people. Criminologists, forensic psychologists, everybody. Some experts think Nilsen, he wanted this control, this possession that went beyond death itself. Remember how he'd take photographs of the bodies, all posed?
Like he was setting up some grim photo shoot.
Exactly. Everything points to this deeply disturbed mind trying to exert control over the one thing no one can control, death. And it's important to remember Nilsen claims that he was drunk for some of the killings, but he never used it as an excuse, never tried to say it meant he wasn't responsible. In the end, his actions were driven by this need to dominate, to possess.
And that need led to the deaths of at least 15 young men. Many of them, they were from the margins of society, people who might not be missed right away.
And what's truly haunting, some of Nilsen's victims, they still haven't been identified. It just adds another layer of tragedy to the whole thing.
And that's what we're going to talk about now. The unidentified victims, the families who are left with so many questions. It's just heartbreaking.
It really is, and it highlights something that we don't always think about in these cases, how far the impact reaches. It's not just the victims, it's the families, the loved ones, everyone left behind trying to deal with the unknown.
Imagine being a family member and knowing that someone you loved, they knew Nilsen. They disappeared during that period. The not knowing, the wondering. It would be a unique kind of torture.
Absolutely. Nilsen confessed to all these murders, but he was also known for making up details, even whole confessions. So we might never know the full truth about what happened. It's terrifying, really.
And it goes back to that need for control, doesn't it? Even after he's gone, in a way.
Exactly. Nilsen's need for control, it was in everything he did, even after he was caught. It reminds us that justice, understanding, it doesn't stop with an arrest or even a conviction. For the families of the unidentified, the search for answers never ends.
You mentioned earlier how forensic science is always advancing. Is there any hope there in these kinds of cases?
I'd like to think so. Technology is always getting better. There are always new tools for investigators, DNA analysis, facial reconstruction, even things like isotope analysis, where they can look at trace elements in the remains to see where a person might have lived or traveled. These are all things that can still bring answers, even after all this time.
Well, that's something at least. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the big takeaways for you, the things that really stick with you about Dennis Nilsen?
I think it's that chilling reminder that we can't judge a book by its cover, you know? This man, he seems so normal, so average, but inside there was all this darkness. It makes you question everything you think you know about people. Anyone, even someone who seems totally ordinary, can be capable of terrible things.
It's a scary thought, but an important one. It's about the two sides of human nature, right? The good and the evil that's inside all of us.
Absolutely. And Nilsen, his case, it highlights how important it is to be aware, to never underestimate how dark humans can be. But it also reminds us that people can be incredibly resilient, how much strength it takes to keep looking for truth and justice, even after something so horrific.
And maybe most importantly, it reminds us to remember those who were lost, the ones we know about and the ones we don't. Their stories deserve to be told, their lives remembered.
I couldn't agree more. There's a hole left behind when someone is gone, but their stories, they remind us of what makes us human. And they remind us to never stop fighting for justice, for everyone.
That's a powerful note to end on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the life and crimes of Dennis Nilsen. It's a case that just gets under your skin, doesn't it? It's horrifying, but it makes you think about what it means to be human. We're back, and I have to say this deep dive into the case of Dennis Nilsen just gets more unsettling the deeper we go. The unidentified victims, the families left with so many unanswered questions. It's heartbreaking.
It really is. And it highlights something we often overlook in these kinds of cases: the ripple effect of the crimes. It's not just about the victims themselves, but about the loved ones left behind, grappling with the unknown.
Imagine being a family member of someone who knew Nilsen, someone who disappeared during that time. The not knowing, the wondering if your loved one was one of the unidentified. It's a unique kind of torment.
Absolutely. And while Nilsen confessed to numerous murders, he was also known to fabricate details of his crimes. He even claimed to have made up some confessions entirely. So there's a chilling possibility that the true extent of his crimes may never be fully known.
That's a horrifying thought. But it also speaks to a need for control, doesn't it? Even from beyond the grave, in a way.
Precisely. Nilsen's need for control permeated every aspect of his life, even after his capture. It's a stark reminder that the pursuit of justice, of understanding, doesn't end with an arrest or even a conviction. For the families of the unidentified, the search for answers continues.
You mentioned earlier the advancements in forensic science. Does that offer any hope in cases like this?
Thankfully, yes. Technology is constantly arriving, providing new tools for investigators to revisit cold cases. DNA analysis, facial reconstruction techniques, even things like isotope analysis, which can help determine where a person lived or traveled based on trace elements in their remains. These are all avenues that can potentially provide answers, even decades later.
That's something, at least. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the biggest takeaways, the things that really stick with you about the Dennis Nilsen case?
For me, it's the chilling reminder that appearances can be deceiving. Here was a man who blended seamlessly into everyday life, yet harbored unimaginable darkness within. It forces us to question our assumptions about the people around us, to acknowledge that even those who seem ordinary can be capable of extraordinary evil.
It's a disturbing thought, but an important one. And it speaks to the duality of human nature, doesn't it? The capacity for both great good and great evil that exists within us all.
Absolutely. And Nilsen's case underscores the need for constant vigilance, for never underestimating the depths of human depravity. But it also reminds us of the resilience of the human spirit, the unwavering pursuit of truth and justice, even in the face of unspeakable horrors.
And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us to cherish the memories of those lost, both the known and the unknown. Their stories, their lives, deserve to be remembered and honored.
I couldn't agree more. Their absence leaves a void, but their stories can serve as a reminder of our shared humanity and the importance of seeking justice for all.
That's a powerful message to end on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the disturbing and ultimately tragic case of Dennis Nilsen. It's a case that continues to fascinate, horrify, and challenge our understanding of the human condition.